Welcome into the Husker247 podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Brian Christopherson here on Tuesday morning. Brian, you were back from vacation. You were well rested, and you were treated to some exciting Nebraska football changes and news during what should be the slowest week of the college football calendar. Nebraska replaces its defensive backs coach, Evan Cooper, with John Butler. Let's just start right there, and we will probably stay there for a little bit. What was just sort of your initial reaction as you came to learn that Nebraska was moving on from Evan Cooper and was going to be changing out what feels like, or what has felt like, one of the key pieces of the Matt Rhule staff?
Yeah, I mean, we can't underplay that Evan Cooper has been regarded by Matt Rhule and his fellow coaching peers on the staff as just a great evaluator for them. I mean, his salary kind of shows what his value was. Like when you think about how much he was making as a position coach that wasn't technically a coordinator. I guess he was like a passing game coordinator, but not like a D or O coordinator.
Right.
He still was up there with his salary. And he's been with Rhule at all his stops, basically, and just was a trustworthy guy who I think the term diamonds in the rough is overused, but he was very good at finding, I think, players that not everybody in the country was locked in on. And then Nebraska would offer and someone else would pop in. And so I don't want to undersell that loss at all because, just a few months ago, when Rhule would talk about like the future of Husker football, um, kind of in passing, tongue in cheek, but he'd talk about like 10, 15 years from now, like Evan Cooper coaching this team or Rob Dvorak. He was one of those guys that got named off like that. And so when you see like, oh, he's suddenly gone a month from the season, even if maybe there was some knowledge before we knew that was going to happen, that's a big deal. And, I obviously Matt Rhule was prepped for it because 14 hours later, you have John Butler's name floated, and he's got a really good resume, you'd have to say. So I think that maybe eased some of the anxiousness, but it's never an easy deal when you're switching such an important part of your staff less than 4 weeks from fall camp.
Is it, before we dive into the Cooper specifically and Butler specifically, I do want to ask this. Does it surprise you at all that this is now back-to-back years in which Nebraska's replaced a position coach about a month before the season starts? Last year, Bob Wager, your tight ends coach, has the DUI. Nebraska gets a resignation, and you end up with a graduate assistant coaching, or a quality control guy stepping in to coach as a tight ends coach for you for the rest of the year. Here you are with Evan Cooper. Again, a situation where it feels like we don't know the exact reason why he's not Nebraska's defensive backs coach anymore, but you get the sense that it was a pretty large decision for Matt Rhule to accept that resignation, or to even ask for that resignation, however we want to phrase it. And yet Nebraska again finds himself down a position coach right before the season started. Should this be a concern at all, 2-year pattern here?
No, I think it has to be more coincidence, right? I mean, you don't plan for these things.
Sure.
It's obviously a jolt for it to happen this time of year for the second straight year. But there's no way, like I don't think I can connect the dots and say, oh, there's some underlying problem, there. It's just like one of those things where the timing for 2 years in a row has been kind of awkward. I feel like this one is more significant than last year.
Oh, certainly. I
You
agree.
know, I mean, Bob Wager was just getting started as a college coach. We didn't really know what he was going to do in that role. He didn't contribute as a recruiter I mean, you couldn't even get in the same conversation to what Evan Cooper has done throughout his track record. You think about some of the doors Evan Cooper had open for Nebraska too, Schaefer, like the Miami recruiting. Like I know Phil Simpson was big in that when he was here, but he's not here. And now Evan Cooper's gone. And Evan certainly was big in like Ja'Cory Barney and some of those guys like that. Maybe even, I can't remember the Vincent Schaefers exactly who all popped that one together. But definitely he was from that area and helped Nebraska there in a spot that has been good to him so far. So you think about all those things, but to your question, no, I can't say like, oh, I'm really concerned like this is going to happen every year. I just think it's been an odd deal where it has, and fortunately, in this case, it appears though while we're doing this pod, it hasn't been officially announced, but there's a understanding John Butler is going to be that guy, and he was a coach, who has the experience that you like and was in the running to be the DC for the Buffalo Bills, coming off this season. Didn't get that job, but was in the mix there. So obviously he's a guy who I think is going to get players' attention with like when they look, okay, he's been here, here, and here. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Before we get to Butler, I do want to say I feel the biggest loss with Evan Cooper isn't going to be so much what we saw from the on the field product of Nebraska, but as you've mentioned, I kind of viewed him in some ways as sort of the architect of how Nebraska's roster came together. I mean, he watched a lot of film. I think he was kind of a guy, regardless of position, that would give uh give Matt Rhule some names, basically like I like this guy, I like this guy, I like this guy. And it wasn't always guys that ended up as defensive backs. And sometimes there were players like Jalen Lloyd or Bryce Turner or Jeremiah Charles. You mentioned the diamond in the rough. He was never unwilling to watch film of individuals. He was never willing or unwilling to potentially have Nebraska take a chance on a player that no one else was recruiting, because to him, if it meant a certain, level in terms of the track time and the frame and everything is there, then they brought him to camp and it worked out. They were going to be interested. I think it's a pretty big loss for Matt Rhule's evaluation operation. Like the recruiting staff has been in a bit of a state of flux from the changeovers from the off season. You have a change now with Evan Cooper. They have certainly Keith Williams and Vince Ginta and Ryan Callahan and all of those people over there and several others whose names I don't have top of mind. But I do wonder if there's an opportunity to potentially empower some other people to
Mhm.
restructure maybe the role of what your recruiting department sort of looks like and what you're looking to do. I just think the loss of Evan Cooper extends beyond just the on the field product, and where it felt like he was really valuable. And you mentioned this, but just I want to hammer it home is just what he did in terms of the evaluations and kind of almost being, without it ever being said, but kind of almost being Rhule's right hand man when it came to that stuff. I just think his value was so much more than just defensive backs coach, and that's why, as great as the resume is for John Butler and this idea that potentially someday he could be your defensive coordinator, which is putting the cart pretty far ahead of the horse, but the idea has certainly been out there. It just feels like less so to me, the loss of Evan Cooper will be felt with defensive backs, but more so with kind of what the roles that he had away from just the defensive back room.
Yeah, I think Evan Cooper, like even when Matt Rhule was considering taking this job, um, we've heard this from Matt Rhule that Evan was one of the guys he like leaned on right away. Like, what's the talent? What do you see in the talent like in that area, like within the state's borders, like in that 500-mile radius? Like, because if you're an outsider looking in, you're wondering like, can I recruit locally to Nebraska and have that be a ticket item for me? And I think Evan Cooper's evaluation skills were trusted there, where he had a voice in Rule's ear during the decision process. Like, yeah, there's guys there. You can definitely land like your Caden Vermoss type athletes that maybe if they were at Modern Day or something would be a little higher up in the totem pole with some people. Like I think that shows you how valued he was. So like you said at the beginning, it's a resignation, whatever the details may be, that I'm sure was not it's a big deal. Like it's one of those that I know like other schools across the country who they know how other programs operate and who matters a lot to it would look in and say, man, that's whoa. Like that was one of those ripples, there's ripples to it that extend out of ways. I'm just from the lake, so I'm using examples like that. But yeah, it was a big deal. Like it dropped on at what 5 o'clock on Friday, the day after the 4th. Um,
Yeah, I
it
was on a boat. You were at a lake. I was at a lake. my cell service was waning right when I got the phone call that this was coming down. Got a text off to Brunts right before the SOS popped up on my phone. Had no idea whether the text went out. Got into a spot with service again. My phone blows up, so I knew that everything had happened. But yeah, that was a Friday news dump of all Friday news dumps, if we're being honest. Right after a holiday, people expecting a long weekend, nobody really expecting much news. And there you have Nebraska without a defensive backs coach.
Yeah. And one more thing. I mean, Cooper, along with Dvoracek, you're right. Like it, and I mentioned it in a column with John Butler, because John Butler, as we'll get to, is like somebody who does have coordinator aspirations. That's what he said in the
And
interview.
experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, that could be a lure down the road, but I mean, we'll get to it. Tony White could be here 4 years, like
Right.
sometimes it's easy to always say like, oh, he's going to be out the door the next year. And I never want to imply like this is the last year of Tony White, nor does anyone want it to be. If
Right.
they keep having the success they've had, no one's going to push him out the door the way they're going. But yet, this offseason, if you remember in the spring league that they were running, one thing I like that they did, and I think this is where Rhule is sharp. Like he had Tony White was almost taking like the head coaching duties sort of in that spring league in some capacity to get ready for that sort of thing when it does come. And Dvoracek and Cooper were two coaches, especially who were kind of calling defenses and some of that stuff within that league as they shared during interviews. So that shows you, I mean, he was one of those guys, not only as an evaluator, but as a coach, you could have thought of him like for a role like that, down the line at some point. So it's a big one. And I do think there's, I'm not saying there's a few little holes in the wall that can be covered up, but there are things you're going to have to uh, patch together when you lose a guy like that who has meant so much to your recruiting evaluation.
The good thing about the patching is that they've got a guy in John Butler that usually, if you're losing a coach about a month before the season starts, you're not just anticipating someone that has Big Ten experience, coordinating experience,
Yeah.
has been a well regarded coach in the NFL, a well liked coach, which I don't think should be lost on this, and only stepped away from the Bills, not because of performance reasons, but because he didn't want to be the defensive backs coach anymore. He wanted an opportunity to elevate his game. And so I don't know what that means for Nebraska long term, but to have a guy like John Butler just readily available to step into a role that, as we'll get into later in the podcast, you need someone who's going to be able to help develop and bring along some young guys in a critical season. And you got to feel good if you're a Nebraska fan with how shaky everything probably felt on Friday night to then how good the picture seems when you can plug John Butler in there. It's not to say that it's just going to be a seamless transition, but a veteran coach whose experience exceeds Evan Cooper's pretty substantially. And a lot of your defensive staff, if we're being honest, outside of maybe Tony White, um, this is a veteran coach, and I think it was necessary that you move on from Evan Cooper. It's good that they were able to find someone with this kind of resume as you go into what is a really critical year and at a key position.
Whenever there's an assistant coach hired, there's always this, okay, is that a good or bad hire? Nobody really knows. And they do these Google searches, and they try to piece together an opinion on it. But his is easier than most as far as just like what his track record is and where he's been for you to be like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you'll get a coach and he might very well be a very good hire. You just don't know off the surface because there's limited data to go off of. He's got a lot. Um, on there, when you go through it and, being also in an organization like the Bills that has been right there fighting to be at the top, in the NFL, he's used to kind of chasing after for championships, and you can insert your jokes or whatever here. As Vikings fans, we feel that all too well, but the Bills have been in the mix and he's been in that fight. So I like all that. I like that he, had that experience at Penn State during kind of a tricky time. He was there like right after some of the Paterno stuff with Bill O'Brien. And that wasn't the easiest coaching situation to be in. So he's been through some things where you got to fight through. I know he's had stuff with the Bills, obviously a serious injury last year that everybody saw on national TV, but he's had depth problems he's had to battle and stuff. So he's seen a lot, and that should help him, even though he's got a short runway. And I wrote this, and this was my main point of that Tony White column this weekend. Not about how long Tony's going to be here or anything, but I just think Tony White's demeanor is so critical here. Like, you listen to him talk and you hear how he takes input from fellow coaches and how he's then able to translate his mission and what he wants to get across to the coaches and players. I think that helps in a process like that, to have kind of a cool hand, as it seems like Tony White has.
Yeah, and he'll also be big in the transition for John Butler because Tony White used to be a defensive backs coach, and I'm
Yeah.
sure he's as well versed in what's in that room and who the guys are, and can help make that handoff as John Butler gets started with Nebraska. I the other thing, Brian, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm any kind of Buffalo Bills expert. This might be shocking to people, but I'm not. But what I do know about them, or what I feel like I know about them, particularly with their secondary, is that it feels like he gets really strong performances from players that aren't necessarily just like slam dunk first round talent guys. Like Micah Hyde has had a nice career, and he didn't get started at Buffalo, but Buffalo ends up with him, I believe, as a free agent, and he's just continued to be one of the better corners. Like when he got hurt a couple seasons ago, or it might have even been last year. Like that was one of the big things they've had to replace. You mentioned this. They had, I think, 3 of the starters of their secondary missing at times. Well, they were also one of the better defenses in the NFL. Like he has had to manage crisis football before, and he's been able to coax and get strong performances out of his players more often than not. And so that helps me, at ease with the idea that this is a big development job. I mean, you've got Tommy Hill that you don't want to see him take a step back from where he was at last year. Someone's got to line up, not across from him, but down the way from him at the other cornerback spot. You've got a safety room where you lost Omar Brown and you lost some of the veteran, leadership there. So you've got to have guys like Deshaun Singleton and Buford and others step into these roles, and they can do it, but you also are now transitioning who the top of that room is. And so I think it's good that he has all of this experience and a lot of success to go along with it, because I think it would, assuage some of the fears that some of these players might have. And it could help, be a relatively seamless thing by the time they get rolling in August.
Yeah. And you have guys who understand too that this changeup wasn't done lightly or anything like that. I mean, they know that, and the timing is a challenge. But that you think of like Isaac Gifford in the spring, and like his determined interview he had with media where he's like, I have unfinished business here. Like I had to come back, basically, was the gist of that. And so guys like that do help at the top. You're right. He's got to develop, like the 2 deep is very much in flux. Like it's going to be
Yeah.
really interesting, like not only who the second corner is, like Blyhill's got to come back from his injury, but like, is Jeremiah Charles in that 2 deep? You've got these interesting names. Obviously, Sierra Wright is going to be interesting. But the safeties, the fact that you have Buford, Singleton, and Gifford and Hill now, who I think has, really turned a corner at the end of last season as far as just his mentality and like what he wants out of the game and stuff. That can be a really helpful tool to a new coach, that you've got like 4 guys that are like a nucleus. I shouldn't leave off Hartzog either. Hartzog's played a lot of
Yep.
football.
Well,
So
before we dive too much into that,
yeah.
we're gonna get into the whole defensive backfield. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're gonna start going through some of these names, get some of the guys Brian mentioned there, and we're gonna walk through what John Butler is inheriting, and then maybe I don't know, maybe some of the deeper cuts or different players that potentially could have opportunities this year, or we could see more of this year than what we have seen in the past. So all of that and more when we return here on the Husker 24/7 podcast. Okay, Brian, you were cooking before I rudely interrupted you, but I want to at least set the stage for where we were going here, and I wanted to give listeners an opportunity to listen to the great advertisements that we have here on the Husker 24/7 podcast. So you were saying, you were talking about Nebraska's defensive back room and kind of where things are situated. You mentioned Malcolm Hartzog. He's sort of fascinating to me because he spent his first year as a corner, under the old regime. Matt Rhule and Evan Cooper come in. He kind of bounced around a little bit, but it looked like he found a home at safety. Do you see now with Sayer Wright in the mix, Nebraska leaving Malcolm Hartzog at safety? And where do you think his impact could come this year?
I don't know. And by the way, I was cooking prematurely. It's like if someone's coming home at 6:30 and you
You
made
just
the
had to
meal.
you had to let the oven preheat a little bit. You were so
Yeah,
excited to kind of get things in the oven.
I
You
put it
forgot
inside.
to let it preheat so it didn't cook too soon.
It's gonna be cold by the time she gets home. So that was a mistake. But that's a good one on Hartzog. I know. Okay, what Cooper told us in the spring when he had his time with the media was that he felt like last year he more or less stretched Malcolm a little thin because he was asking him to kind of bounce around and be that jack of all trades guy. Maybe we didn't get the best sampling of Malcolm Hartzog last year because he was put in sort of difficult positions where he had to do this over here and then that over there. And so he said, I really wanted him to lock in at safety. I think he kind of listed why he thought he could be good there. But the question you pose is a good one because it's all going to be about getting your best 5 or 6, out there. And if Buford and Singleton are ready to roll, we know Buford is. And if Singleton, who's been back, he's doing team activities, as we were told in early June, can find his stride. Those are two guys that are tough to leave off the field at safety. I thought Singleton was one of the better defenders on the team the first month of last season. And so I love a healthy Singleton Buford combination if that can work, if they're ready for that. So I don't know where that puts Hartzog. I just know that he's one of those guys. We didn't have him on our indispensable Huskers list. And I'll be honest, when I was doing it, I was like, he's kind of the perfect name for that list that should be on there regardless of if you know where he's at, because he can do a lot,
Yep.
like he's going to matter.
He's gonna
He's
play. He's gonna be
yeah.
utilized. We just aren't sure how.
You got to have guys like that who are just critical to, like, Justin Evans is like an example on the whole line. He can do different things and they just matter and no one talks about them as much, but they're important. And so Hartzog's that kind of guy, I think.
Yeah, well, real quick on the most indispensable list, very difficult this year, and it felt like names 11 through 24 you could put in any order, and then there was also 25 through 30 where there was maybe six
Yes.
other people that could have been on as well. I felt like this was a more difficult than usual year. Anyways, enough of that. Back to the secondary. I want to ask you about some of the young guys. Do you think we could see some freshmen or redshirt freshmen find their way onto the field in 2024, not just in mop-up duty, but as we saw last year, they are not afraid to go into the two deep, or if a guy is flashing on special teams, to give him a few run of opportunity, during a Big Ten game or during the Colorado game, as we saw with Mekhi Bear. Is there anybody that you are watching that maybe might be off the radar of Nebraska fans, or just newly arrived that could be a person that we could see more of in the secondary?
Yeah. First off, I don't think Charles is off the radar, so I won't say him. I just think
Yeah,
people,
I think he's very much on the radar.
yeah. So I would say, I wonder about Dwight Boodle. Like,
That's who I was thinking about.
if he catches steam. He was actually working at safety in the spring game, but again, this is where it gets interesting. Maybe that a new coach has a different eye for it, right? Like where a certain guy belongs, and you never know how that could go. Um, I think of Caleb Benning. I mean, I think of somebody like that, even though he just got here this summer, who I know has a really high football IQ, has been around it, understands sort of what's expected with Nebraska football. And Caleb's one of those guys who just, whenever he's on the field, he just finds a way to make plays and get stuff done. So a true freshman in the secondary is not something I count out of the mix. Even someone who just arrived. And I do think one of the exciting parts, if you're new here, is that even though we always like, it does feel like there's 20 some guys over there, but there's not a real certainty of the pecking order after like the top 4 or 5. It's very much wide open for someone to bounce through the door. And we have seen in the history of Husker football, both in good and lean times, there have been true freshmen who have popped up and played in the secondary. And so it's hard to predict like who's going to have it figured out like a few weeks into fall camp enough to like be a factor there. But there will be one or two, I bet, who are fairly new, who like there'll be like a story on like August 12th where we're writing about somebody who's kind of new to the mix, or someone we weren't talking about at all that's been in the roster and kind of below our radar.
Do you have do you have any strong thoughts on Sayer Wright and what that might mean for Nebraska's defensive backs pitcher as well? The USC transfer has starting experience, a guy that has flashed in back-to-back camps, according to USC media, a guy that practices really well, a guy that's a ball hawk in practice, but only has one interception in games so far, and was part of a pretty bad USC defense. But it's hard to know how much he was underserved from coaching or anything like that. Your thoughts on Sayer Wright?
Quite simply, I just don't think they would have brought him in if they didn't think he could have a shot to fight right off the bat, and obviously his USC background. We all know USC hasn't been a juggernaut on defense, although EA Sports has them as a top 25 defense along with Colorado. But we won't get into that bulletin board material. I just think any guy who has started games at a place like USC, I kind of like, all right, that could be he's a player. He's got like the traits. It's just a matter of how does he fit into Nebraska's way of doing things. That is something that is an adjustment for some guys. I think like, Stephon Thompson had to deal with that. Micah Mazuka had to deal with that when they first arrived. The difference was they had more of a runway. This is not much time. So, but I am definitely considering that he's in the running to try to win a job, especially with Bly Hill out of the mix. And also, I love they obviously loved what Bly Hill was doing. The way Tony White talked about how he's doing his scrimmages, he was obviously a factor, and he was probably going to be the starter leaving the spring prior to the injury. But he hasn't played at this level either. We got to remember that. So sometimes I think the conversation drifts to, when Bly Hill comes back, he'll have to earn it too, because there's some guys who actually have played more snaps than him who will be, elbows out for the same thing he wants.
Yeah, it's the Bly Hill thing. Like, do we have any idea when it might be reasonable to see him on the football field again? Like it seemed like he didn't sustain as bad of an injury as expected. But do you think it's possible that he's just out there at fall camp, or do you think this is kind of like, Buford a year ago, or I'm blanking on another name. I know there was another player where they were kind of slow with bringing them back from injury last year. Do you think it's like maybe mid-September before we see him? What are your just general thoughts? I know I'm asking you to know the unknowable, but that's your job.
Well, we do know that Rhule said the rehab is going to bleed into the season. So we know that I don't suspect he's going to be a factor in fall camp unless there's a surprising turn there. And that's what makes it difficult, right? Like he could be one of your top 2 or 3 corners. However, it's a tricky little injury to come back from. Shouldn't say little, tricky injury to come back from. And you've got to do it in your first year of big time college football. And you've got to jump right into the middle of the game. Like the game, it's already started. Like you could be 3, 4, 5 games in, and it's like, okay, you're out there now. Like that. I mean, it's a tough assignment when you really think about it. Sometimes we act like it is a video game where it's just like, oh, he's back now, put him in. Doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't quite work like that. There's got to be a little bit of build up, and there's that mental part of like, okay, I'm out here now, lined up against friggin' even if it's Illinois on a Friday night on national TV, like it's like nothing you've ever done before, and you gotta have a lot to handle that. So we got to remember all that.
Well, and Bly Hill specifically is jumping levels too. So it's
Yeah.
as he's rehabbing, as he's putting himself back in the picture, that also whenever he returns will be his first game at the FBS level. Anything else you want to dive into defensive back wise? Any other names? Any other players? Anything specifically about John Butler? I'm leaving the ball in your court. You can go wherever you want. You can go left, right. You can go between the legs. You can go behind the back, spin move, Euro step, whatever you want to do.
No, I just think
You can pass. It looks like he's going to pass.
no, I'm not going to pass. DBs could have already been argued prior to this weekend as being one of the maybe the most interesting camp story, actually. Like I don't know. People would say, of course, it's quarterback. You got to for sure have the coach at some point say, "This guy's the starter." Everybody wants that like headline. I get all that, but let's be honest. A lot of people think they know where that one's headed, and if
Dylan
you're talking,
Raiola.
oh yeah, you gave it away. If if you're talking about position groups where it's just like, there's like, I feel like it could be really good. And Matt Rhule did say last press conference, because I asked him about the corners. I was like, what are you thinking there, about where it stands a couple months out? He's like, we're going to be good. He was just resolute about it. But there are guys that are going to have to immediately contribute who have not played yet at this level. And so, a couple guys, not but you're going to need like a Jeremiah Charles or somebody to jump in there. And there's going to be another freshman. So I think it's one of the best position groups to follow in fall camp. It was that way before. Now it is especially so with a new guy leading it. I think John Butler, the one thing that's probably going to be good is he's done like the interview stuff up in Buffalo and stuff. Like they made him accessible for things like that. And so I don't think he, sort of like Glenn Thomas, like you could tell Glenn Thomas was not phased at all by like, oh, this is Husker football. Everybody's got a question from left field or right field for you here. I don't think John Butler is going to be bothered by that part at all, or worried by it as a veteran coach and having been where he's been. So I think that's a useful thing when you come to a place like this.
Okay, let's finish up with this. It's been a bit since I think you've been on a podcast. Nebraska's had a few commitments. I just want your off the cuff thoughts on a few of these players. You ready?
Yeah, my brain will try to work as fast as it can, which is about as good as my internet speed here sometimes.
Houston Kahina Torres.
I mean, that one, okay, here's what I liked about what happened there. The O-line, it felt like for a few days was like, what's going on? Because they had missed on like 2 or 3 guys that were really good prospects. Nebraska's right there, but finished second or third. And then over a matter of just like 3 or 4 days, it was like, okay, never mind. Like, when you think about like how the recruiting has gone at the O-line, and you actually write out the names from the guy who you just mentioned, Tapu,
John Hammerbeck, who we'll get
John
to in a second.
Hammerbeck, but also like last year's class, the class before that, that list runs like 13, 14 names, and they're all
Yeah, they're
solid.
all in the program right now. They're going to
They're
have a reckoning of figuring out who, is next.
Yeah, they're all solid prospects. So I was not that worried prior to these last commitments about the O-line, because I thought, you know what, they got a lot of guys to develop already. Like that, yes, you want to keep adding, and you think they're good players. Every class you're trying to do that. So it was just I don't know, whipped cream on the top, I thought, to get a prospect like that. And I think it shows the connection. Rhule, I think, forms with guys in the real talk that's away from the cameras. Like sometimes everybody gets caught up in like how someone does interviews and things like that. And that's not where it matters with recruiting. It's like those relationships when it's just him, the recruit, and the family. Like how do those conversations go, and how can he communicate sort of what his way of doing things is as an O-line coach and what it'll mean in this program. And I also think O-line recruits pick up pretty quickly that group is actually really close. Like that they really do like Riola. And so they'll come and visit. And even the guys who didn't pick Nebraska will say that. Like John Mills said that. It's like, man, those guys love each other. I mean, I remember him saying it.
Cade
And
Massey last year, yeah.
yeah. So that definitely leaves an impact, and I think sometimes that tips it Nebraska's favors when it's like a tie with someone else or it's very close.
Also, always nice to get the top offensive lineman out of Hawaii in 2 years in a row, and they've got offers out in 26 and 27. So maybe the old pipeline that people have been clamoring for a while could be growing out of Hawaii. All right, next name, Jeremiah Jones, defensive
This,
athlete or just athlete, because there
yeah,
is a chance he could play wide receiver or tight end. I am very skeptical of that. But Jeremiah Jones, maybe the widest range of outcomes in the class.
I love this one.
Not
Yeah,
like finished, not like what he's going to do on the field so much, but just like the different types of positions or the way his body can grow. With Jeremiah Jones is what I mean by that.
yeah. I love this one because I agree with you. I think defense is probably where it's at, but then you see stuff like when he went to Florida, popped into Florida State's camp, and they worked him at tight end the whole time. And our reporters down there were like, yeah, he was like one of the best dudes on the field, just sort of playing a position that maybe wasn't the first one on his board, but he's just showing I can do it a little bit of everything. He's got a confidence about him. He's very detailed. Like the thing that is pretty impressive about the recruits they've been getting when you do interviews with them, Jeremiah Jones falls right in line with this. They've got guys who are just sharp, really sharp, and so it makes you think like these are the type of guys who can come in and yeah, they're great athlete, but they can also like just adapt maybe quicker, like than some guys you. I don't know. I've done interviews with people in the past where I've wondered like how's that going to translate because you just don't know if the kid's got quite the what it takes like when he gets here and he's falls right with all these other guys when you talk to him. It's like, man, that's an impressive guy. Like I couldn't have done an interview like that at 17 like he did with me a week or so ago. And so he kind of won me over just through watching highlights and stuff, but then actually talking to him and he's like taking notes on his visit, like it's impressive. I really I think he will be a popular. I don't want to influence this, but I think he'll be a popular sleeper guy when we do Super
Ooh.
Sixes down the road.
All right. I mentioned his name earlier. I call him defensive Nash Hut maker Sean Hammerbeck from Winter, South Dakota.
I mean, I tend to like these guys who Midwest have had a lot of steak and corn and just like get after it. And I think he's one of those. He falls in that line, like just a Midwest lineman, like plug him in. Um, you know, work on his body for a year or two. And we'll see in like 26, like if we're talking about him, as we mentioned, there's going to be good competition to sort that out. But you want to be a development program. They've got the guys that you want to develop. Now it's just a matter of who can do it. Can Nebraska get like those guys to be at some point where you're stacking up an all conference guy every year, and then you have another guy on honorable mention? Like that's what it's got to get back to. And then you've got to have those guys who maybe they aren't on the top of the radar for 2 years or so, but suddenly they get plugged in and you don't take a step back at all. They've just been kind of working and they're ready to roll. And so you're hoping like guys like Hammerbeck and some of these guys help sort of getting that wheel turning. Like we've talked about that among many topics for 10, 15 years too.
Yes, we have. All right. Any closing thoughts? Any banter you want to bring to the table? Anything you want to get off your chest here in the final minute of this show?
Not a lot. My brother introduced me, not like I didn't know what pickleball was. How can you miss it?
Hmm.
Um, but I kind of fell for it on the trip to Minnesota. We made a makeshift court in our driveway up there, a little smaller than standard size. My brother's good, so he tested me, beat me, but I was like, man, this game is kind of addicting. I understand it. I get why why the coaches at Nebraska set up like tape in one of the concourses and have pickleball tournaments and stuff like that. It makes a lot of sense to me now.
Yeah, I pushed last year. I'll push again. Would love to see a Nebraska media pickleball tournament and the winner gets to play against a Nebraska assistant or coach, and we all get to watch. That's what we need to see here.
That sounds like something Rhule would maybe do too. Like,
I
I think
know. I pitched it last year, and I thought there might be some traction to it, but never heard if it went anywhere.
I think if you ask that question, like to finish up a presser, like it'd be worth seeing if you got some traction off of that. I don't think I'm going to ask it, but if you want to ask it,
That's
I
okay.
will.
If you want to be the guy in the back who said something dumb, that's okay. And then you get the squinty, and then it's kind of like trying to figure out who you are. Yeah, I'm good at that role. I can do that. We'll look at
I've
that.
said something dumb, but Rhule would maybe go with it. He's really good at stuff like that. Like the one day I was wearing my Twins T-shirt in there, and it had the line from a Beastie Boys song, "Mad Hits Like Rod Carew." I made mad hits like Rod Carew, and it was a 1977 MVP Rod Carew shirt. And Rhule was tickled by it. Like it was like a reference, like he's not that much older than I am. He's kind of
Rhule seems like he grew up liking the Beastie Boys.
yeah. Well, it was definitely clear he did. Because he was kind of punching it out the lyrics as he left the podium. But anyway, I thought I like that. It's nice when you have like just fun banter, and it doesn't always have to be like the biggest
adversarial relationship of all time.
Or like we're talking about something that's not it's football. It's fun. There's fun attached to it. So
fans around here would love for football to be fun again, Brian.
Yeah, and if there's pickleball like attached sort of on the side, just as a tentacle reaching out, I'd be all for it now after my last week up in Minnesota.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes another great edition of Husker 247 and its podcast. You can check out everything we have going on at the Husker247.com. What we have going up right now, we have most indispensable Huskers dropping new ones every single day as we work our way to number 1. I'm fascinated because I've already forgotten what our list looks like. So every day for me, it's like, oh yeah, that guy. And then I go cross-check where I have him. And sometimes I didn't even have him on there. And Brian and BC voted him so high that I often wondered what I was thinking when I put my list together. But later this week, I'm gonna self-scout and assess why I picked who I did and who I left off and all of that great stuff. You can find that at Husker 247. We have plenty of recruiting stuff. I ran through all the uncommitted official visitors and put them in tiers as to, Nebraska's chances for each. There might be something in there about a certain David Sanders Jr. that people might be wanting to check out. I don't know that Nebraska is completely out of that recruitment. Just to throw a little, spicy meatball out there on the number 3 player in the country. And you can find that at Husker 247. So plenty of stuff there. We'll have more podcasts, more content throughout the week. So be sure to keep it tuned to Husker 247. For Brian, I'm Mike Schaefer. We'll be back later.